working on the Riley again. I've actually been working on it the last 3 or 4 days, doing a job again I thought was only going to take a few hours, and it ended up taking way longer than I thought. You can see it's got 3 of its wheels on now, and I was doing the 4th, and I ended up with an interesting problem, which was the brake drum down here wouldn't fit on the hub properly. What was happening was when this drum fits on here, it sits flat, hard up against the flange on the hub. This is why it's important that you have the right size hubs for the right size drums, because you can see this drum actually has a little machined face in here. And there are 2 sizes of hubs, and the other size is slightly smaller. And because it doesn't take up all of this flange, you can end up with warping on the brake drums because the flange only sort of comes around to here. That's obviously not the problem I had here, but I thought it might be something to do with the hub I was using, because the hub I originally had here was from my very original pile of parts, and it wasn't really the best. It was pretty battered and pretty rusty, and needed a bit of straightening and things like that. So I thought maybe it was something to do with that. And then of course I remembered the parts car had hubs on it as well. So I thought I'll grab one of the hubs off that and try that. And it turns out on the parts car, it had that problem with the front hubs being the 2 different sizes. And of course, the one I needed, which is the offside one, the right-hand side one, was the smaller hub. So I ended up taking the studs out of that one because being a left-hand side hub, it has opposite thread on the wheel studs. So I had to remove those and fit these ones from the hub I'd previously rebuilt. Now, luckily, I hadn't peened these over. I actually just torque them up and use Loctite on them. And I'm pleased to say that looks like that'll work fine, because it was just as hard to get the nuts undone on this one as it was on the original one with the nuts actually center punched in place. So I'm pretty confident now. I actually had to use heat to get the Loctite to unstick to be able to undo them. So I did that, and I put them in the new one and still had the same problem. And it took me a long time to figure out exactly what was wrong. And I still don't quite understand why it was only this hub that had the problem and not the other 3. But basically the issue is the hub is located, or the brake drum rather, is located on the hub by this little machined step in here. And that's what this main circle hole locates on. But then these studs also locate into these. And what was happening was, I think some of the studs were very slightly oversized. And I thought I could figure out which one it was by removing them one at a time and checking to see which pair of studs was binding up. I thought that's not going to take me too long to figure out which one was actually the culprit. But it actually took me a long time, because in the end I found out, I think the issue was that these were very slightly oversized, and it was messing up the gap between this step and the stud, so that you could actually get this to the point where there was only one stud on it and it still wouldn't fit over the drum. And the reason is because this and this wouldn't fit. So effectively the gap between there was too small for this to fit over it. So I ended up just very lightly machining the studs and putting them back. And I checked very carefully to make sure everything goes back together with no slop and there's no movement or anything like that. So I then had to repaint everything. I baked the paint on, and luckily remembered after I'd baked the paint on to come and refit the hub while it was still warm from being baked on, so that made it slide on easily. So this drum should now fit on and fit flat. The reason I knew it wasn't fitting flat, one, you could sort of see, but two, these are the little screws that hold the brake drum in place. They wouldn't go into a thread in, so that's basically what was wrong there. So I'm going to go ahead and put this front drum back on and get the wheel back on. I have bolted the radiator supports in place. They're just lightly bolted up now, and have confirmed from several sources that yes, this is in line with the front axle. I have heard of some people moving them forwards a little bit, and I think that's just to give themselves more room between the radiator and the front of the engine, because it gets pretty tight in here. But I've gone with what seems to be original and just put them in line. I have got the brake pedal connected up to the brake mechanism. I've got the right piece in there, the right linkage, and that all actually works. I need to get more clevis pins. So I have got a set of them, but they're cheap and nasty ones, and they don't actually fit. So I have to get some decent quality pins. The engineering shop up the road only had longer ones, so I'll order some shorter ones. But this kind of shows how the brake mechanism works. So the brake pedal just rotates on the shaft, and it actuates this rod. I did have to drill the hole in the chassis for that rod to go through, which turned out to be rather difficult. I ended up effectively wearing out a step drill bit and then tungsten burrs, which is what I had to use to finally make the hole to size. But that now goes through there. It's a little bit close. I may need to make the hole a little bit bigger. There is clearance there, but it's not completely centralized. But you can see how when you press the brake pedal, that pushes this rod back. And if you imagine the cable goes from here around to the back pulley, so that pulls that back cable, and then it loops back around through here and around this one out to the front. So that pulls the front cable. And then this gives you adjustment on it. So that's how that works. I do need to attach this, which is the pulleys that go on the cross member under here. I just can't get to it at the moment to drill the holes I need there. So I need to do that. I've also been cleaning up the front pulleys, but I want to zinc plate the little bolts that hold all of that together, and I've run out of zinc for my zinc plating. So I've ordered some more zinc anodes for that. And at the rear, my bolts arrived, so I can now fit the rear shock pins. I just haven't done that. I went out the other day and got new welding gas, so I can do that now, which was lucky because the country's moved back into a red setting, so they're encouraging people not to go out, which is good because it means I get to work from home for now and I don't have to commute in. But I wanted to get gas and things like that before all of that happened, which I did. So these are some of the front brackets. These are the bits and pieces that I actually want to zinc plate. They've all just been cleaned up, wire brushed. I should really put some light oil or something on those to stop them rusting until I get the plating stuff. And I do need to trim down the shaft. This pedal shaft is off a saloon car, so it's way too long for the Brooklyns. The actual throttle is mounted on the chassis rail down along here somewhere, so I still need to figure that out. What else? I think that's it. I'll put the front drum on and at least get it back on its wheels. A little bit more progress tonight. I'm still waiting for the tungsten burrs just so I can clean up the hole where the brake shaft goes through. At the moment it's just minimal size. I was using little 3mm tungsten burrs on a Dremel, and I only just got the hole big enough before I managed to break them all. But it's enough to know it works. I just need to clean it up. I've got one on order. I finished mounting the rear shocks. This is another one of those details where it's really hard to see exactly how this was done originally. All of the different cars you look at now are done differently. The original Brooklyns had two ways of doing it, actually. They had it with the shocks the way I've got them, in line with the body. They also had them in line with the axle, which was another setup, and used different sorts of shocks. So I've looked at lots of pictures of originals, and I was lucky enough that a friend of mine was able to send me pictures of what the original mounts were like. So I've built all my mounts to the original specs, and these are the original shocks, the right shocks for this. And I've basically set them up where they fit, because they only really fit one way and work properly. The only problem with them, and I'm imagining this is actually a problem on real Brooklyns as well, is you can't just undo two bolts and get the shocks off, because the top pin faces that way, the bottom pin faces that way, so they're opposing. So even if you undo the nuts on the mounting bolts, you can't slide the shock off. So the only way to actually get them off is to take the mounts off, which is a little bit of a pain on mine, I discovered, because the rear pin mounts are, it's a pin on a tapered block to account for the taper of the chassis rail, and there's three 3/8 bolts there to hold it on, which is more than enough strength there, because if you think there's only that one pin in there holding the shock on, and you've got 3 bolts holding the mount to the body, so that's all good and strong. But the problem is you can't actually get the bolts into the mount with the shock there. So the only way you can actually get these off, and I think this is why they're mounted this way, is to take off the U-shaped bracket, which then lets you pull the shock out of the way, and then you can undo the lower mount and pull that out of the way. It's just a bit of a faff, but it's all doable, or at least it is all doable without a body in the way. With a body there, it'll be trickier, but even then it's not impossible, because the tail of the car basically sits on top of the chassis rail and comes up from there. So everything this side of the chassis rail is in open space, so you can get to everything. And you can actually get to the other bolts under the bottom of the car. Although with an under tray in place, I'm not exactly sure how that would work. So I don't know if the under tray goes completely under the bottom of the tail. I imagine it does. So that's going to be interesting. Once it's all actually together, I can't imagine you'd ever really want to change the shocks. They should last a long, long time. So I think that is all correct, and that's how it's supposed to be. The other thing today was my parts from the register spares arrived, which was great. So these have all turned up. The first thing that came in this package was the piston rings I needed to fit the number 4 piston finally. So I've got the piston all in place. So the pistons are all in there, the crank's in there. I still need to use the stretch gauge on the conrod bolts. They're special ARP bolts, and I had to buy a special gauge to be able to tighten those up to the correct torque. And I need to fit the flywheel properly. And that needs quite a huge amount of torque on it to do up the nut that holds it in place. What I think I will do is basically follow Mr. Tweed's example, and I'll build a plate that fits on there that locks the flywheel from turning so that you can get enough torque on this nut. I think it's 140 foot-pound or 160, something like that, which is quite a bit. The other thing I will do is heat up the flywheel before I put it on to expand it slightly so it'll go down on the taper correctly. That's all in there, and it all rotates. I would show you it rotating, but I can't really do it with one hand. It is very it's not stiff, it's just not freely rotating. And that could just be because it's all new. It's also covered in oil. I put oil on everything. But you can rotate it with one hand with a little bit of effort, and there is really good compression. So if I put my hand on there and rotate it, when it's doing the intake stroke, there's a lot of suction there. So I think that's all good. Everything's sealing properly. One mystery I need to sort out, another one, is this is the inlet camshaft. This is the back of the camshaft. And because this car has a magneto, you can't run a coil off, can't run a tachometer off a coil because there isn't a coil. So the way they did it originally was a mechanical tachometer driven off a slot in the back of the camshaft. And this is how you access it. And it looks like these holes here are something somebody's added afterwards because they're not tapped straight. If you put a screw in there, I think it's a 2BA or a 4BA screw, it's completely wonky. So I'm not sure what was going on there. I do have over here, this was in my original parts. This is a rear camshaft bearing, and that's a little screw-on cap. And this is this piece here, which is the camshaft rear bearing unit. But then I'm not exactly sure how the cable fits in. So in the parts book here, there's this number 7, which is camshaft rev counter drive. And I'm assuming that is what goes inside here somehow. To engage with the slot on the back of the camshaft, there must be something that goes in here and then is held in place by this cap that the cable then connects to. I don't know what that is yet, so that's something else I need to figure out. And it occurred to me that I probably should have fitted this before I fitted all the rotating assembly. So I now need to get this rear bearing out. I should be able to sort of knock it out. I'm assuming it should probably come out backwards and then push this one in, which might be interesting. It may actually be too difficult for me to do that now without taking it all apart again. So there are units you can get that will let you run an electronic tachometer off a magneto. So it may be simpler to look for one of those. It's some time before I'm going to need that anyway, but in which case I will just have to make a little blanking plate to go on here, which is easy enough. So need to sort that out. In the parts, lots of other things came. These are the water takeoffs from the engine. So how any of these seal without leaking is a bit of a mystery. So that fits in there. Obviously there must be some sort of sealing washer there. Actually it goes this way. So that goes down like that. These are held in place with what's called a yoke. So this fits through this. And then you've got these nice brass dome nuts to seal them there. Again, there must be fiber washers and things involved. And the way these work, these little yoke things, I think I'm going to have to run a tap down in those threads because that's pretty tight. But the way these work is they kind of hook into the block. That's why they're that funny shape. And then they pull. So when you tighten them up, they sort of lock in place. There's one here and there's one on top of the head, which is here. And whoops. That they do say when you undo these to to make sure you don't end up dropping that yoke down inside the head or inside the side of the block. Now that is stuck. Luckily this is just a spare. So that's going to be interesting, making all of that watertight. What else did we get? There's some parts here which are for the magneto. This is for the magneto drive, which I guess comes off. Take this. That'll come off there, I think. No. How will that work? Okay. No, must be. Okay. No, I don't understand how that's going to work either. Trying to figure out what that'll be driven off. So the magneto fits in here. Is it driven off the camshaft? The joy of trying to figure out how this thing all goes back together. Okay, that makes more sense. So that'll get driven off the camshaft like that because it's at 90 degrees. So this is the housing. The magneto sits down on top of this. This is the front half of the case. That bolts on there. This drive fits down inside there. So yes, it'll engage with one of the camshaft gears like that. Pull this away. So one of the things I need to do is sort out sending off my magneto to have that rebuilt, or at least remagnetized, but chances are I'm going to need it all rewound. I think there's a couple of people in New Zealand who can do that. And then the correct banjos and oil fittings turned up as well. So the way this works is this goes into the front of the rocker box. The camshaft rocker shafts sort of are behind this. Then there is the little banjo, which will have the Y pipe. This will make up one of the ends of the Y. So there are two of these, obviously one for each rocker box, and the pipe gets soldered into there. That then fits on there. Again, there must be sealing washers and things that go inside there. I think there were meant to be some little copper washers, but they don't seem to be here, which is fine. I can get those locally, no problem. And then there's this special bolt with a little feed hole there drilled through. So that will all bolt down like that. And that goes on the front of the rocker box, and that's your front oil feed. So with those, I can actually now start rebuilding the oil system, which is kind of at the moment sitting over here all in bits. I did get some new 1/8 tubing because I want to remake all of these smaller pipes. I'll reuse the fittings probably because they're just soft soldered in place, so I can easily get those undone and reuse them. And I did get somewhere all of the proper brass oil fittings and things, including, if I can get it out, the correct threaded on the inside and outside bulkhead mounts. That's what those are called. So I now have all the right fittings to redo the oil system. The only thing I'm missing from the brakes at the moment, and somebody has kindly offered to send me one of these, is the rear pulley. So this is the mount that goes underneath here Also in today's package were the missing cotter pins, so the brakes are now all actually locked in place, just loosely at the moment. But underneath there, you can see the little arm. This is what this, what would you call it? A yoke, I guess, fits on. So that fits on there like that with the pulley wheel here, which is what the cable loops around. So when you pull on the cable, you can see it pulls that lever, which eventually touches this, which transfers it across to the other side. These are the two brake return springs at the rear, because there's two on the front, so you need an equal spring force on the rear to counteract the two return springs on the front. I believe that's why there are two of those. The handbrake I won't do until I've got the cable brake in place, because I need to know how long to make the rod that actuates it. So for now, I've just cleaned up the clevis end that goes on the end. It's a 5/16, I think, thread. That fits on the back. On the bottom of the handbrake mechanism, there's a thread as well. So I just need to make up a 5/16. Well, I'll probably use 8mm because I can get it. Rod with threads on either end to link the handbrake mechanism up. And I think that's about it for now. It's good to finally have this as a rotating assembly. Like I say, I probably should have done this first, but I didn't find that missing piece until recently. So I'll see how hard it is to get this out and replace it. So the next step will be do that, finish bolting all of this up, and I now have all of the parts I need to start assembling the rocker gear as well, so I can start assembling the top end of the engine, which will be good. And once the flywheel is on, of course, the clutch can go on. Once I've got the clutch on, I can start looking at assembling the engine and gearbox and actually get the engine sitting in the chassis. I'm still sorting out, talking to the inspectors about the car, so they'll want to see it pretty close to this stage, I think, because they can still see everything. Everything's only loosely attached at the moment, so anything they want to look at can be taken off and put on. Eventually it's all going to have to be stripped down anyway to be painted. The chassis will need to be painted, I guess, various other bits and pieces. So it's going to be kind of a long, complicated process. And then I want to make sure, obviously, they're happy with all of the body and the mechanicals, not the body, the chassis and the mechanicals, before I go ahead and start making a body for it, which would be the next step. And I'm still waiting for my zinc, so I can zinc plate some of the hardware. Yeah, I think it's getting there. The last thing I should mention is a thanks to another channel who mentioned mine, Shed by the Tracks. So he's got a Model T Ford that he works on, and he just mentioned a few of the channels he watches. There's a few in there that I've been following as well, a lot of the smaller channels, and there are some new ones in there that I need to check out. But it's kind of funny how there's these funny little communities of smaller channels doing car stuff like this, and I tend to find those a little bit more entertaining, because it is just people working on cars. They're not working on their YouTube, if that makes sense. So as I keep saying, I'm building a car, not a YouTube channel. So when I finish the car, which is probably going to take me years, so don't worry about that. I don't know what I'll do. I'll go back to building Enigma machines or something. But a few of the channels I follow is Shed Racing, Ivan, of course. So he's in a different league to us amateurs mucking around at home, obviously. He's got a bit more experience than we do, but his content is really fascinating. And it's just, again, working on cars and making old cars go. A lot of stuff a bit more exotic than anything we'll ever see, but still fascinating. And Cold War Motors, I think, is the other one, which is interesting because they're just messing around with cars. But that's quite a big channel now, I think. And who else? Kyle at Carter Body Restyling. I can't remember the name of the channel. I have them all linked, so I don't need to remember what they're called. That one's really good because he's finishing metal to really high standards. It's not just get it to a pretty close standard and then bog over it. It's sort of proper metal finishing, which is really, really interesting to see and sort of inspires me to try and do better with mine. There's also Wild West Garage. Like the garage. I know I said it the American way, which is also similar, interesting metalwork and seeing how they solve the problems. It's a really big channel now, but obviously Project Binky, when it comes out, I've been following that for years, obviously, like most of us, and I'm really impressed that they've stuck to their exact same format all the way through. So if you watch one of their first videos now, it's exactly the same as it is now. So they just do what they do. And it's really good at showing how long all this stuff takes. I find a lot of the bigger YouTube channels, once they start doing it for YouTube, it all starts getting a bit fake. And they'll rebuild a crashed supercar in an episode sort of thing. And it doesn't go into all the actual detail or the complete agony it is trying to build something, especially when you're trying to build something old like this, where you don't have any manuals, you've never seen one before, there isn't one you can just go and look at and copy. You have to figure out every single little detail to try and make it work. So finding channels where there are other people doing that kind of stuff is really cool and interesting, and it keeps me motivated. And I forgot, obviously, to mention Alan, Mr. Tweed's garage. Very important to mention because he's the only other person really who has a decent amount of Riley content on there, actually showing some of the details of Rileys and how they work. Obviously his is a Riley saloon car, but it is still a Riley 9. So a lot of what's on my car and how things work on my car is exactly the same as on his, because that's kind of how they built these cars back in the day. There were a lot of shared parts and bits and pieces. So, for example, the steering box is exactly the same. The silent third gearbox is just standard Riley stuff. Mine's got Brooklyn ratio gears in it, but functionally it's the same. Rear axles, all that kind of stuff. So seeing more Riley 9 content is really good as well. So I look forward to his films all the time.